my name is Kin, and I've spent the last 16 months building a Star Wars themed build in Satisfactory, and thanks to 1.0, is now complete. This video will walk you through the build, show you how it works, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've learned in case you missed any of those 878 hours of live streams. Finally, I'll talk a bit about what my plans are for 1.0 moving forward. I started playing Satisfactory in February of 2023, and it quickly consumed all of my gaming time. In my first playthrough, I built a Star Destroyer turbo fuel factory, and I realized I wanted to take it up a notch and build my favorite ship in Star Wars, a Super Star Destroyer. I wanted to make it a working factory and greatly expand the scale of production. I also knew I'd need the motivation of being able to show it off to help me actually complete the project. Combined with a long-time desire to start a YouTube channel for myself, I decided to launch construction in June of 2023 with no live streaming experience and only a few hundred hours in Satisfactory. But I had my hook, Star Wars. Maybe that would be enough to launch a YouTube channel into monetization. I had no idea. The plan for the Super Star Destroyer was to use it as an oil processing plant that could handle all the oil on the map and make the power we needed for the entire save. As an added challenge, I wanted to make it not only flying, but entirely free-floating. No belts, pipes, or trains providing the inputs and carrying away the outputs. That meant drones. A lot of drones. More importantly, it meant having to package a very large quantity of oil and water. 10,500 packaged oil per minute, and 31,200 packaged water per minute to process all that oil. So long before Update 8 hit and I started my channel, I got to work on SatisfactoryTools.com and planned out my factories. I broke the entire save down into a handful of mega factories. A starter factory, a water packaging factory, an oil packaging factory, the battery factory, of course the Super Star Destroyer oil power plant, and finally a factory for the Phase 4 space elevator parts. I then went on to determine which giant Star Wars structure I would base each factory's design on. By the way, my most asked question since I began my channel is how I planned these mega factories, and I'll go into more detail at the end of the video, but a major focus of my 1.0 playthrough is going to be teaching how I plan my factories. So the plan was set, and Update 8 and my channel both went live for the first time on June 14th, 2023. Shortly after, my first edited episode of that VOD was published, and that episode 1 continues to be my most viewed video on my channel. I, in fact, blew up on YouTube on my first video, which is exceptionally rare, and I have all of you to thank for that, so thank you very much. I began my save, like many did in early access, in the Northern Forest, and built my hub on the border of the forest and rocky desert. The resource concentration was so good, Coffee Stain nerfed the hell out of it for 1.0, which is understandable. That start was absolutely broken. I had two main goals with my starter factory: to provide us a steady supply of all the items we'd need to begin work on the mega factories, and to experiment with a system I saw in a Stin Archie video where he used vertical buses to build his factories. He showed the techniques could be useful in allowing easy expansion and flexibility in factory construction, and I wanted to put it to the test. Over the next 100 hours, I built what I dubbed my mega starting factory that automated and centrally stored all items up to radio control units and supercomputers. I, of course, learned a lot, not just about the vertical bus, but also about modular design and how to make better use of the Blueprint Designer. I've got a video dedicated to my mega starting factory and the vertical bus, when to use it and how to set it up, linked in the description. Overall, I was very happy with the starter base, especially with my aluminum setup. It's a very efficient build that needs 480 bauxite per minute, and if you're having trouble automating aluminum, I suggest watching episode 9 of the Star Wars playthrough. I've also linked that in the description. Once the Mega Starter Factory was online, I turned my attention to the infrastructure my plan would need and designed my train blueprints. Of all the things I created, my train blueprints and later iterations on giving of the curve and incline at the same time, are some of which I'm most proud. The blueprint includes 2 separate, 2-way train lines, 2 sets of 9 belts, 1 for each direction, and room for pipes underneath. All the infrastructure a growing fixed operation needs. I did, however, make a huge mistake when designing them. I included way too many signs. By the time I was done, each blueprint had almost 100 signs on each one, and throughout my playthrough, I built hundreds of the blueprints. This was a major contributor to me hitting the object limit just 6 months after beginning my playthrough. I do intend to try to be more careful with signs in 1.0. We'll see. What I should have done is made a fancy version for the most viewed portions of the map, and a basic version for the backwater areas no one sees. Either way, I do freaking love how these blueprints look. It was about this time that I came up with an idea to use the priority power switch, new in Update 8, to send myself items remotely. We've all been there, being frustrated at running out of inventory items while you're at a new location and having to travel all the way back to your storage. It's such a problem, Coffee Stain Studios included the Dimensional Depot to solve the issue in 1.0. Back in the fall of 2023, however, all I had was the priority power switch and some iron ore, but I got it to work. I designed version 1 live, and that's still the version I'm using in the playthrough. But over the course of the next few weeks, I made a lot of improvements to it, and came out with a few videos showcasing the newer blueprints. The improvements included using a closed system of water packagers instead of iron ore, and incorporating drones. In fact, one of those videos is my second most viewed video, and I've linked both in the description if you'd like to have a look. It's hard to know for sure, but I think the Dimensional Depot, new in 1.0, will effectively eliminate the need for this system. There may be a few edge cases where it would be nice to have some remote control over item flow, but for the most part, Mercer Spheres stole my thunder. But that's okay, I did it first, Coffee Stain, so there. The first mega factory of the system was the water packaging factory. I decided to design it to look like the Imperial Tower from the end of the movie Rogue One. I found a few online 3D models and used large metal pillars and custom angles to get the shape of the structure right. It was a lot of math, angles, and measuring, but it really came down to using an online rise-over-run converter so I could figure out how to get the angles I wanted in-game. Once I knew the rise-over-run, I could use beams in the freeform mode to lock in the exact angle and then build large metal pillars accordingly. I continued to use this custom angle technique to determine my angles for the Super Star Destroyer later. I designed a place for the space elevator so it could be my satellite dish, and I think it really turned out well. I did have a very hard time working on this beast, but I managed it with just the hover pack. It was such a pain that I couldn't imagine doing it again for the other mega factories. This led me to switching fly mode on for all future factories. But I can proudly say this first one was completed without fly mode. The first hurdle inside was fitting the giant train stations. Even though the factory is huge, it was barely big enough for the 80 train stations I needed. 40 for loading 31,200 packaged water per minute, and 40 for unloading 31,200 empty canisters per minute. I broke them into 10 cars per train on 4 lines. The train would drop off the canisters before picking up the packaged water. The actual water packaging wasn't that complicated. A single blueprint that made 580 packaged water per minute. One change I would have made, if I could do it over again, would be just to have each blueprint package a full Mark II pipe of 600 per minute. I was overly worried about not getting the maximum flow out of a Mark II pipe because I was able to get max flow consistently with oil elsewhere later on. It would have helped me to simplify, just a little, the real complexity of the factory, the logistics of belt compression, which I'll talk more about in a minute. The water itself was pumped out of the ocean, ran up the back of the building in 62 Mark II pipes, and up into a gravity-fed liquid system. I always recommend using gravity feed, or pumping the liquid up to a high point, with or without containers, to establish a head lift before running them into your machines or system. It really helps cut down on fluid issues. Combined with never using pipe floor holes or wall holes, pipe wall supports are okay, and making sure to give yourself extra room when placing pumps, will all eliminate the vast majority of fluid issues. A little design work goes a long way to ensuring less fluid troubleshooting time. The trains themselves took a lot of work to get right. There's a limit on how much each locomotive can pull, on how steep a slope, on how full a train car. But I set 2 locomotives for 10 cars and tried to ensure no slope went steeper than 2 meters, and I think I made that work. The biggest problem was train bunching. No matter how careful you are to spread out your trains, eventually they will start to bunch and leave large gaps when no trains are picking up your items. To solve this, I added a delay at one station in the schedule to make sure the trains stayed spread out. The problem was that it increased the overall trip time by the delay. so I needed even more trains to cover, which can lead to train congestion. But I got it working eventually. I want to talk a little bit about bell compression, or the issue of trying to fit 14 belts with 580 packaged water per minute on them into 10 belts with 780. I experimented with several designs, but I really got the solution when a viewer suggested I take a look at the Satisfactory wiki, where I came across this design of 2 smart splitters and 2 mergers. This module is the most powerful tool in belt logistics in the game in my opinion. It really fixes 3 problems with one tool: belt compression, or taking many belts with fewer items and compressing them into fewer belts with more items; belt decompression, the opposite issue; and the need for smart mergers. Now, if you've really dove into belt logistics in Satisfactory, you may have realized we need smart mergers just as badly as we need smart splitters. The ability to prioritize which input gets used first in a merger is very important to help make complex logistics work without backing up belts, and I do hope to make a dedicated video on this topic in the future. Just know my entire system would grind to a halt without this little blueprint of 2 smart splitters and 2 mergers. It's that powerful. Before moving on to the oil packaging plant, we need to talk about how I used the train line infrastructure to transport all the oil to the Spire Coast, and why I established the needed headlift for the oil long before it arrived at the factory. Remember that my train blueprints include Mark II pipes beneath exclusively for oil transportation. The issue is that when the oil arrives at the oil packaging factory, it will have to go up through a complicated network of packagers, and I wanted plenty of headlift without having to put a bunch of pumps in such an intricate system. So to solve this problem, I built these giant oil towers. These were designed to look like the tower in Star Wars Rebels and the Ahsoka TV show. They can pump 5 Mark II pipes all the way up, establish a very high headlift, taller than the factory the oil is headed to, and then go on their way. Doing this saved me countless hours of troubleshooting oil flow later. A few other fun trainline projects was this perfect 3-way junction, which was more difficult to get right than it should have been, and this mega spiral. This is actually a mega blueprint that I built that is much larger than the blueprint designer, all with no mods and no SCIM file editor. I've got a dedicated video on how I made these blueprints extend outside of the designer in a video linked in the description, and I must give credit to PopCac on YouTube and Twitch for showing me the trick that got me started building this massive beast. Eventually, all trains and pipes lead to the oil packaging factory, the Galactic Senate building. This factory has 2 main jobs: to package 10,500 oil per minute, and be a staging area for all the packaged water and packaged oil to be sent to the Super Star Destroyer power plant via drone on the roof. I actually worked with the channel members on my Discord to help me figure out which building this factory would be designed to look like. The design was the Senate building from the Star Wars prequels, but with the top sliced off so we had enough room for drone ports later on. The circular and rounded off nature of the building was a huge challenge, but I think it turned out pretty well. Although I do admit it does look a bit like a giant mushroom, or maybe a lampshade. The oil starts its journey up the train line and runs up the oil pipe spiral. Remember, it has plenty of headlift to flow up these pipes with no pumps needed. I love how it turned out. While the oil travels up the pipe spiral, the packaged water travels via train up the train spiral. This thing is very unnecessary and very awesome. It increases in elevation 1 meter every 8th rotation, so each rotation all the way around only goes up 8 total meters. I love seeing the massive amount of water trains at once. It helps give the entire system scale. The next floor focuses on unloading the packaged water and loading up the empty canisters back onto the trains for the return trip to the water packaging factory. There was some congestion in this area that required some fun troubleshooting to increase train speed while leaving the stations. As a side note, the train spiral also includes the battery train that passes through this floor up to the top floor of the factory, but more on batteries in a minute. Once the packaged water is unloaded, it heads up to this massive set of vertical belts to the previously mentioned top logistical floor. But before we can get to that, we have to turn our liquid oil into packaged oil. The outer portion of this cone is logistics, but the inside is where the fun begins. Through this door leads to the Grand Convocation Chamber, my second favorite design of mine after the Super Star Destroyer itself. These Senate pods are active oil packagers, and figuring out how to get them to scale up in this conical pattern was actually easier than it looked. I honestly can't believe how well it turned out. To oversee this oil packaging operation is Emperor Jar Jar himself, formerly known as Representative Binks III. Many have speculated on the whereabouts of Representative Binks I and II and blame me. However, as you can see, he's the boss, and it was him the whole time. Once the oil is packaged, it joins the packaged water and batteries in the top floor where they are managed along with the corresponding empty canisters. These large structures are belt balancers. Through testing, I found that when a belt was misbehaving, overly full, or empty, it would cause a chain reaction of other issues. One belt of water empty? Well, then the oil that gets processed along with that water would also back up, and then we wouldn't get canisters back from 2 lines instead of just 1. Less canisters means less water is made, and then more belts lack water, and the cycle repeats. Adding these belt balancers helps solve many of these issues. Now, when there's an inefficiency, it's spread out among many belts instead of being focused on one area. I plan on building more of these in the future as they are a great piece of redundancy that helps smooth out logistical issues. They work by evenly splitting out each of the 10 belts into 10 new belts for a total of 100. Then, remerging 10 of the splits back into 10 new belts. The new belts are now fed by 1/10 of each original belt. I also made a 7-to-7 balancer for the oil and oil canisters. I hope to make a dedicated video on this topic in the future as well. Finally, we have our drone rooftop. A culmination of all those oil pipes, head lift, water packagers, trains, belt compressors, belt balancers, and batteries. All so that we can send 10,500 packaged oil, 31,200 packaged water, and return back 41,700 empty canisters per minute. Speaking of batteries, let's turn our attention to our penultimate mega factory, the Jedi Temple Battery Factory. The last piece of the puzzle before the Super Star Destroyer could be fully operational was a massive amount of batteries to not only fly the inputs in, but the byproducts out of, like plastic and petroleum coke. So I decided on a massive Jedi Temple-shaped battery factory that produced the maximum amount of batteries possible. It uses all the bauxite and sulfur on the map to make 4,170 batteries per minute. As I mentioned, it does need plastic and petroleum coke, which are produced at the Super Star Destroyer. So there was a little bit of a catch-22, as I needed batteries to make batteries. To solve this problem, I built the Super Star Destroyer first. But the problem wasn't as big a deal as I thought, and the better move would have just been to build the battery factory first. It would have taught me a lot about mega factory planning that I could have applied to the Super Star Destroyer and saved a lot of time. As it turns out, I took the lessons learned at the power plant and applied them to the battery factory, which helped me knock out this factory pretty quickly with relatively few issues. The design itself is pretty straightforward. I'd always planned for it to be the Jedi Temple, and location-wise, I wanted it to be visible from the Super Star Destroyer, as well as near my existing train lines, so I could use the train lines to help supply inputs and deliver the batteries to the top of the Senate building. Although I was unprepared for how large it ended up being, I love how it looks at a distance. The factory starts in the basement, where I've got 3 train stations set up. The first is for the delivery of my items from the remote switch. The second is for battery output to the Senate building, and the third I ended up using as bauxite supply. It was originally intended to be used for battery output to the final space elevator factory, which sadly won't ever be built. The remaining inputs of water and various raw resources were piped in, belted in with the train system, or flown in from the remote areas of the map via drone. Moving into the factory properly, we have our first lesson learned from the Super Star Destroyer: early planning and organization of a factory's power network. So much wasted time tracking down and trying to remember which power line goes to what is solved with just a little bit of planning and a dedicated power room. One trick I started doing was putting a priority power switch in front of my light switches so I could turn them off remotely to save on either power or frames per second. I'd like to take a minute to go over how I used blueprints to build and organize my production. I've used many of the same principles in the Super Star Destroyer, so I'll go into a bit more detail about the system now. I used this flowchart from satisfactorytools.com to break the production into 4 parts. Groups of machines that perform that task were labeled A through D. I then designed the blueprint that grouped those machines together. I was then able to plan my production in terms of groups, which had several machines instead of each individual machine. This made the entire process much easier to wrap my mind around. Once I knew the inputs and outputs of each blueprint, I put it into Excel and determined the most optimal grouping of blueprints to use to help simplify the input and output bus lines. For example, if I grouped exactly 5 blueprint A's together, I'd need exactly 300 water per minute for all 5. This made fluid management painless, especially compared to what I had to deal with in the Super Star Destroyer. I could also make underclocked or overclocked versions of each blueprint in case I needed to fine-tune a group of blueprints' inputs or outputs to take advantage of full belts or full pipes. This trick is one of the planning strategies I'll be going over in detail during my 1.0 playthrough. One thing to note is that I didn't end up building Blueprint D, as it was needed for the final space elevator factory that will not be built. The last set of blueprints to talk about are these input and output bus line blueprints. They are made to be able to quickly belt and pipe the materials into and out of the long lights of machine blueprints. This is another tactic I will be using in the future. Blueprints A through C are spread out across the 3 main floors of the battery factory. Blueprint A focuses on making aluminum scrap. It has 3 refineries and has bauxite, water, and petroleum coke for inputs, and outputs aluminum scrap. This is the blueprint that handles the water byproduct shenanigans found in making aluminum. The level change between the refineries help to ensure that the byproduct gets used correctly. Because the byproduct use is confined within the blueprint, it's something I didn't have to worry about once I knew the blueprint worked. Blueprint B makes the all-clad sheets and is my most complicated blueprint of this factory. It has 1 refinery, 4 smelters, and 4 assemblers. The inputs are the aluminum scrap from Blueprint A, water, and copper ore, and it outputs all-clad aluminum sheets. The final set is Blueprint C, and it makes our final product batteries. It has 1 refinery, 1 constructor, and 1 manufacturer. Inputs are the all-clad sheets from Blueprint B, water, deuterium ore, sulfur, and plastic, and outputs, of course, are batteries. To move items between blueprint lines, I have these large buses that travel between floors and in front of the machine lines. I thought I had planned for enough space, but as I'm sure you know, in Satisfactory, there's never enough space. Many of the inputs come from the rooftop, and so they float down from the ceiling of the 3rd floor. Drones on the rooftop bring in the petroleum coke, plastic, and deuterium and bauxite from distant nodes. I also need to send up a supply of batteries to keep the drone ports moving. Overall, I'm happiest with this factory's design technique. I feel like I really hit my stride with the logistics and the planning here after the hard-earned lessons of the Super Star Destroyer. One thing I'd have loved to do is incorporate the belt balancers from the Senate building. I just didn't leave myself enough space, but they would have really helped keep things flowing smoothly. I do wish I had had more time to troubleshoot, as there are still some simple issues with the factory that could be fixed that's causing some inefficiencies. However, I overbuilt with so many batteries that I'm still making more than enough for the drone ports I need. Speaking of drone ports, we come to it at last. The centerpiece of the save and the reason I started my YouTube channel in the first place, the Super Star Destroyer. All 3 mega factories and the train line infrastructure were built to support this one single building flying off the Spire coast. I've gotta say, it's mission accomplished. Entirely free-floating except for 1 tiny power cable running to my power network. I couldn't be happier with it. It processes 10,500 oil and 31,200 water per minute, creates more than 15,000 fuel per minute for power generation, 5,700 petroleum coke per minute, almost 10,000 plastic per minute, and 2,700 rubber per minute. Much of those outputs are used in the battery factory, but some were set to be used in the unbuilt space elevator part factory. For the design of the ship, I used many online references, but mostly I focused in on this blueprint and a small model I have on my desk. I almost bought a $500 6-foot-long 3D printed model of the ship, but alas, maybe next Christmas, right? I scaled the in-game structure so the industrial fluid buffers would be the appropriate size for these very tiny spheres you see on the top of the tower. The tower itself I used as a gravity feed for the fuel before heading to the fuel generators. I used many of the same design techniques I worked on with the water packaging tower, a rise over run calculator, and beams in freeform mode. All angles, including those in all 3 dimensions to achieve this arrowhead shape, were completed using these methods. In the center of the ship, I made graduating platforms to build the fuel generators on. They act as the building-like structures found in the center of the ship design. I didn't know how many fuel generators would fit when I built it, but I made as much room as I could and focused on the aesthetics. And I figured I'd overclock or underclock the generators as needed. I bordered the platform area with drone ports, which looks great, but ended up being a nightmare when it came time to complete the belt work on the ports. Each 780 per minute line of packaged water or packaged oil actually requires 2 sets of 2 drone ports for full throughput. That's 4 drones and 4 ports, 2 at each location. All drone port outputs head to belt balancers. Likewise, the drone inputs, empty canisters, get balanced before being sent back to the ports for the return trip. Like the Senate building, I built 4 10x10 balancers for packaged water, and another 4 10x10 for the empty canisters that travel with the water. There's 2 7x7 balancers for oil, and 2 more 7x7s for the oil empty canisters. In future projects, my preference would actually be to rebalance all belts of like-type materials together. That would be an insane 54 belt by 54 belt canister balancer, a 40 by 40 belt water balancer, and a 14 by 14 belt balancer for the oil. Like most of the rest of this playthrough, it would be insane, but it would be awesome. Like the battery factory, I broke down all the jobs of this power plant into blueprint groups. I also paired each of those blueprints with a bus line blueprint to help speed up logistical hookups. The first blueprint makes petroleum coke. It has 2 refineries and 1 packager. The only input is packaged oil, but it has empty canisters, polymer resin, and of course petroleum coke as outputs. The next blueprint is for rubber production. It has 3 refineries and 1 packager. Its inputs are packaged water and polymer resin. The outputs are empty canisters and rubber. The fuel blueprint is the star of the show and is the most complicated. It has 2 refineries and 2 packagers. The inputs are packaged oil and packaged water, and the outputs are empty canisters, polymer resin, and fuel. Dealing with all that liquid fuel output is one of the most frustrating aspects of this build, and is what drove me to be more deliberate in how many blueprints I group together on a bus line to ensure I create whole pipelines of liquid and not have any leftovers that need to be combined after the fact. This really is one of the only things I'd change in this entire factory. The plastic blueprint has 3 refineries and uses an interesting combination of recycled rubber and recycled plastic recipes that has some fun recursion to design around. The inputs are rubber and fuel, and outputs are rubber and plastic. The last machines on the Super Star Destroyer are the fuel generators. They consume 15,150 fuel per minute, and although I only built around 1,000 of them, they are overclocked to the equivalent of around 1,300 total fuel generators. I used the total power generated by my power network as a proxy for efficiency as I knew my target power generation. Although I would have loved to have a perfectly straight power production line, I did get to better than 95% efficiency before time ran out on me. Besides getting that power line to perfection, my biggest regret on this playthrough is not finishing the space elevator parts factory. My plan was to build a giant Death Star floating above the center of the map, also fully fed with drones. It's why the battery factory was so large. Even talking about it now makes me sad we'll never get to see it. Or will we? Last June, when I started this YouTube channel, the same day Update 8 was released, I had no idea if I could make my plans work. It was so crazy, I hesitated even talking about them in the early episodes because I thought people would think I was crazy. But here we are, with the Super Star Destroyer processing all the oil on the map, fully fed with drones. When I started this playthrough, I had only about 500 hours in game. Now I have over 1,600. I learned an incredible amount about how to plan factories. The most common question I get about my Satisfactory play, besides if I'm an engineer, no by the way, but maybe I missed my calling, is how I plan my factories. Therefore, I'm going to make teaching how to plan factories the focus of my 1.0 playthrough. My plan for 1.0 breaks down into 3 phases. After the initial spaghetti phase, which should only last a few hours until we get foundations, we'll start focusing on factory planning. I intend for the content to be very beginner friendly and really try to teach viewers how to get the most out of Satisfactory for themselves. I'll be planning my factories live, and my goal is not to show you how to build mine, but to teach you how to build your own. We'll be using satisfactorytools.com and Excel to keep track of what we're doing. We'll work this way up until we automate most of the items in the game, approximately where my Star Wars save built the starter factory to, about radio control units and batteries or so. Then we'll switch from the beginner-friendly phase to my theme for mid and end game. That theme will be a cyberpunk city. dark, tall buildings, lots of neon, purple and red. If we ever get rain back in the game, I'll have it on all the time. We'll have some drones flying around, trucks on the street, subway trains into the city. The plan is to build this all high above the red forest in the center of the map. Speaking of Blade Runner, although I want to stay away from super specific designs for most of my buildings, I do want to use one specific design from Blade Runner, the Tyrell Corporation Pyramid Buildings. I want to build them in the Dune Desert and use them for nuclear. As you may have seen, I didn't do any nuclear power at all in my Star Wars playthrough, and I have never used it. So it will be a main centerpiece of my 1.0 playthrough, and I'm really looking forward to it. If the beginner and teaching focus or the cyberpunk themes sound interesting to you, make sure you look for my 1.0 live streams and edited videos. Yes, I'll be returning to make edited, shorter versions of my long-form videos for those of you who don't have 8 hours to watch my VODs. The edited videos may fall behind the live streams, but I'll work my ass off to get them to you as soon as I can. This playthrough, and my YouTube channel in general, have been a wild ride these last 16 months, and I can't thank everyone enough. For my regular live stream viewers on both YouTube and Twitch, my VOD watchers, the episode watchers, the Kintroll Army, my channel members, Twitch subs, the membership gifters, super chat donators, or if this is your first video of mine you've seen, thank you for everything. I'm excited to see where my channel will be in the next 16 months. On to bigger and better things.